Gary. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Let me be the first to welcome you to India. Namaste. And the other greeting will be our customs inspection, which is the first experience in India, which you realize how many people they have to keep employed. But I first came to India, actually, when I was just out of college, and I was a music student, and I had the opportunity to travel all over India, sponsored by the All Indian Music Federation. And so I don't mean to interrupt my concert here by the great singer Sakli, who comes from Cochin. But I spent 3 months traveling around to all the music academies and performing myself at the time. And so I have a pretty strong feeling for India because it's sort of a world unto itself. And we are going to a part of it which is perhaps the most charming part of it in Kerala, Cochin, and then Mangalore in the southwest coast, the Malabar Coast. And so I'm just going to show you things that we may see here, or you may not ever get to see in our brief visit here. I know some of you were here many times, and so you have considerable experience in India, especially our British friends have a very strong attachment to India for historic reasons. And we come to India facing both an ancient culture, perhaps the oldest culture on earth. The Chinese say they're the oldest, but that's their written language. But the Indian culture was oral tradition of the Vedas, and the religious tradition was passed orally until Sanskrit was written down, let's say. And so then you have what is a very deep religious culture, a variety of people, and then now an overlay of modern industrialization. And where we're going is an example of the booming economy of India. And it's, again, a land of great contrasts. You know the shape of India, it's sort of surrounded by mountains, and it's, as they say, the subcontinent is a world to itself, but has so many different states, 16 states and other territories with, I think, 17 official languages and then hundreds of variations. And so coming from Sri Lanka to here, we have a evolution of both the spoken language and also the written language is different. Now, they're all phonetically transcribed, but they become mutually unintelligible, as if, let's say, every nation had its own handwriting, rather than using Roman letters. And when I first came here, I spent a bit of time trying to learn enough Hindi to get around, but it turned out that I never lived in anywhere where they spoke Hindi as the local language. That is very much the language of the North Indian plain, but down here it's Malayalam, and as in Sri Lanka it was Sinhalese, and then you go to cross the mountains here to Tamil Nadu, they have their other language, and everywhere you have a different language. And so one of the great inheritances of the Raj was that English became the general common language of India to this day. So everybody learns English so they can talk to other Indians. Now, Hindi is the official national language, but again, only a minority of people speak it at home, and many don't get a good understanding of it, even though let's say the nationalist government of India has been trying to make sure that they hold on to their own indigenous tradition and not lose their languages in the face of globalization. Well, we are down on the, wrong way. We are down on the southwest coast, Kerala, if you see there, we've left Sri Lanka, and we're going up the coast to Karnataka, the next state, to Mangalore. Now this is a tip of India, Cape Comorin. We could sort of spy the shore of it as we went by in the night, but then coming up the Malabar Coast into the inner harbor and then the great inner waterways of Kerala, based in the capital in Cochin. Now this is a coastal province, or rather state of India, which had its own history of kingdoms, local powers, and then it had been made a great trading center going back all the way into prehistory. So it's always been a goal of traders from the east and the west to come along here to the riches of Kerala. And to this date, it's one of the most prosperous states of India, but it's mostly low-lying with interior waterways because it has quite a bit of water fall. And this is a view of just the amount of rain that this coast gets, mostly in the southwest monsoon. I don't know if you saw yesterday as we were leaving Colombo, that tremendous storm that hit the town just as we were sailing out. We didn't get very wet, but this was an example of the monsoon season where it can be sunny in the morning and then hot in the day, and then when all that humidity comes up into the sky, suddenly there's a tremendous rainstorms that then, let's say, wash across the land and into the sea. But in Kerala and other parts where they get the biggest monsoons, this is a very serious problem because they are living just above sea level, and then they are so used to extensive flooding that it doesn't slow them down as they go working out in the fields and such. So it reminds me of that old story. The visitor in India stops the little boy and says, "Oh, how long has it been raining?" And the boy says, "I'm only 8 years old. I don't know." But so then there's all the beautiful beaches, the whole stretch of the sea coming up. There's not any mountains along the shore here, but you have this lush interior that is accessed by boats mostly. Now they have built highways and they have airports and all this modern infrastructure is laid over the traditional riverine transport, where they would take their rice boats, cargoes down to a place like Cochin, export it. Timber was a great export also to this day somewhat, though the great forests have largely been cut. It's said that King Solomon sent the first emissaries from the state of Israel to get wood from the Malabar Coast right here to go build the first temple. Now that's a long time ago, but the trade goods continue. Coconuts, rice, cinnamon, sandalwood, and of course up-to-date upgrade software. But in the interior, you take that trip in and you'll see scenes like this. Some of you have already done this. Go live on one of the converted rice boats. By the way, those are all ducks just coming for dinner. And so this place is kind of a vibrantly productive. And then if you're taking one of the backwater tours, you usually get on an excursion boat like this on one of the canals and then go out into the endless maze of different canals and waterways where you can see the rural life and the goods coming down to the markets. But it's a place where, let's say, an automobile is not very useful, and everybody has their own boat or their own little pan to go out and go fishing on. You can see that this waterway is actually above the rice field, so this has been for thousands of years channelized and with sluice gates so that they can raise their crops seasonally, and they have always enough water, and then they can dry out the land to harvest and things. And then they have all of the life in the water that they harvest too. For many millennia, the coconut has been sort of the magical fruit of the tropics. You probably have heard about this, but they have a problem in Kerala in that the experienced coconut harvesters who can run up a tree and pick the right one just ripe and drop it down, now they found that because of universal education and globalization, the young people don't want to learn how to climb trees anymore. Now, my primate ancestors had the same problem. So that they have been trying to invent artificial intelligence-driven coconut picking robots to climb the trees and identify the robots. So they're testing this at a technical institute in Cochin on how they can replace the humans climbing trees even. Well, you never know what's next. Well, the other thing that's happened in this part of India is that they've had, let's say, another wave of prosperity. Now, they were kings and palaces in times before. Now, because of the prosperity of this part of India, they have resorts and fancy hotels and big receptions and tremendous festivals and weddings and such. A couple of years ago, we stayed at this lake resort out on the backwoods out of Cochin. But as you go further upland, you have what's called the Western Ghat, which are the range of mountains that stretch up the west coast of India. Much of it has been deforested. There's still some woods left. A lot of it is converted to tea plantations. And if you get farther up enough into the mountaintops, there's still some virgin forest left that's now in national preserves, and even some scenic mountains that if you go over the passes, then you end up in Tamil Nadu and the other side of the east coast of India, Madurai, and then go down to Tamil Nadu, Orissa, the states on the other side. But again, like we saw in Sri Lanka, because there are mountains, there is always a precipitation, especially in the southwest monsoon. They have tremendous water pouring out off the mountains, down through the rivers, and keeping everything well irrigated and lush with wildlife. So these are just a couple examples of the upland wildlife in Kerala. Lilies and butterflies, and then other birds. This is a kind of a pigeon with this iridescent cloak. And this is the Indian hornbill, which is a rare bird now. And I'll give you the first of my Indian proverbs. A bird is recognized by its song, and a man by his word. And God provides food for every bird, but does not deliver it to the nest. Well, there are other creatures up there. This is the macaque, lion tail, and then the king of the jungle, of course, is the tiger, of which there's still a remnant population right up in the mountains above where we're going to go. Of course, it's under great siege because of the increasing human population and the incursions into what is left of wilderness in India. There are various spots of it along this coast, you see, then up in the central highlands of central India, then up in the north hill country of Kashmir and the borders with Nepal. But the lion is now protected, and in a few places its numbers have been coming back, but all of its reserves are very isolated, so they have the problem of inbreeding and not having enough population to perhaps survive over the long term. Meanwhile, you may see tigers in the zoo or other things in India where some of them are raised, the orphans are raised especially. But again, like in Sri Lanka, the main, let's say, national symbol is the elephant. And again, the Asian elephant has its reserves up in the mountains, and then its place in the cosmology of the religion, especially they adorn it in festivals. But you see elephants imagined everywhere. And of course, the elephant is considered a very wise creature, and it has become a major Hindu god called Ganesha. And this is considered the god of good fortune, and many people make offerings to it, sing songs to the elephant god Ganesha. And I found this illustration. It reminds me of the old story of how did the mouse make the elephant laugh? Well, in this case, one of the mice turned around to Ganesha and said, "I'm pregnant, and it's yours." Well, there are many temples all through here, particularly in the upland countryside. So I'm going to show you just a few of them that are remarkable. And in some ways, you'll see so many temples, but each one is a little bit different. This is a Mamallapuram temple complex, which features, again, great live stone carvings of relief carvings of elephants and battle scenes and gods and various figures. And this is another view of an underground shrine. Now, when we go to Mumbai, there's the great Elephanta caves, which are outside on an island from downtown Mumbai, which again was carved over the millennium out of the rock, and then you go into a cool interior. So these date from about 400 BC. And then there are other objects that are merely venerated up in the hill country. This is the Butterball, which is near that temple. And then another rock was preserved. I'm not sure what it is a monument to, though. Then you have other temples that are constructed almost in a modern architecture. This could be a parking lot in Frankfurt, if you want. But there are the palaces of the former royalty. Now, the great Maharajas and Sultans of Raj, India, had been largely disinherited out of their estates and their power in the local authorities, but some of them are still occupied and there's still some deference given to them. I remember once being a guest of the Maharaja of Baroda, and our academic professors that took us there to see the Maharaja introduced us, and all of our Indian friends bowed down on the floor until the Maharajas told them, "Please get up." He had become a member of parliament, and he didn't like the trappings of royalty anymore. But his palace was, let's say, the biggest thing in town. And this is one outside of Cochin, which features these beautiful carved ceilings, teak wood, many treasures. But most of the royalty has been disenfranchised of its feudal rights to the land, and Kerala in that way has only museum royalty left, no actual power amongst the former rulers. And then came, along with all the Arab traders and all of the Mediterranean commerce and ships from China, these were the first charts of the area by Europeans. Now you notice it says pirates over here on the lower right-hand side, and then the Elephant Mountains above. I mean, this was a mythical coast with many riches, and they would come sailing over here, and you can see how calm the seas are sometimes. So often they would take a monsoon, and then suddenly they'd be becalmed, and then they would arrive and be greeted or else repelled. So when the Portuguese finally came, Vasco da Gama in 1498, he brought Arab navigators and interpreters with him so that he could communicate with the local people. So this is when he arrived in Calicut, which is another bay just north of Cochin, and they began their Portuguese empire, and continued on all the way to Malacca and to Macau and all the way to Nagasaki. And Vasco da Gama himself died in Cochin of probably a tropical disease. People came here, it was usually a one-way trip. And the old saying in Portuguese, we have a small country to be born in, but a great world to die in. And so they extended themselves out quite fantastically all the way to Asia, and then they established their trading posts, which were often seized militarily and then fortified against any Arab or other native or Indian attacks. So Goa was one of the prime ones. This is an island just north of where we are. And it was only returned to the local state of India just about 15 years ago. So this is a history that's still living. And if you go to Goa, you'll see the biggest of the cathedrals and the other remnants of the Portuguese time. They didn't actually take much territory because there never were more than a band of soldiers and sailors. But this was an example of the Portuguese Empire that stretched all the way to Japan at one time. Purely a commercial trading empire. It never was a colonial power. But this is Cochin in 1653, which 35, sorry, that has you can see the city walls, and then the fortress that's there, then across the other river, what it says Cochin, and a lot of, let's say, probably indigenous housing. That's now the modern center of Cochin. So we come in this harbor through a narrow gap between different islands, and then we will dock right along the side of the Mantancheri jetty, unless they put us over in Wellington Island, which is the larger container commercial port. But if you come in here before, it's quite a dramatic harbor to come in. And this is the harbor master's lookout, which is almost a medieval-looking fortress, and an echo of the previous fortifications that protected the island. These were Portuguese-built. We can visit this today. Then there are all the churches, particularly St. Francis Church, facing the ocean, right? As we come in, you'll see this. And it's quite a scenic harbor that way. And the old town is right on the island tip where we hopefully will dock within walking distance of it. And there's an area where there's the old shop houses and commercial center of the old town, which features the oldest synagogue in Asia, built 1344. Now, last time we were there, we could not get in. They were either closed for renovation or they just didn't want to have too many people in it because it's a very ancient building, of course. Now, the community has pretty much left. They have a caretaker, but most of the Jewish population of Cochin has long since moved back to Europe or Israel, actually. But if you don't get to go in, this is what it looked like, a very bejeweled synagogue. I don't think it has a Torah, though. But it has all kinds of glassware and tileware from China because, again, we're right on the trade routes across the Indian Ocean. And so these palaces and the synagogue, in this sense, or even the churches are adorned with all kinds of trade goods. Now, as you come into the old town, and as we go in on the ship, you'll see what's called the Chinese dipping nets, which were brought from China as a way for the fishermen to catch fish by dipping in the water, pulling it out without getting their feet wet, which is what every fisherman wants. So they continue to have them there, and you can see them going up and down, seeing what they catch, because there's a lot of flow, tidal and otherwise, through that gap going out to sea. But recently, they just don't have much fish left. They keep them, let's say, busy to show it off. But you can see that this guy's net is almost completely empty, or else probably now it's picking up plastic water bottles more than fish. And then you go into the old town, and there's still some of the old way of transportation. This is a bullock cart that's carrying some agricultural good to market, which reminds me of another saying in India: avoid standing in front of a judge or behind a cow. And they bring in from the countryside coconuts and spices, cardamom, nutmeg, cinnamon, all these things. And then right in the old town, they still have the drying fields or lots, or else they're on the roof. And then they have traders who traditionally would signal by hand gestures under a towel. They would, count out numbers under it, and so that nobody would hear what the final deal was. They'd all take their turn bidding, and then one of them would get it, just like the stock market works. And so there are these beautiful big old houses in the old town, but it's contrasted quite a bit by the other outlying areas, which is where the new construction is. The Trivin city, and where the political capital is of the state, Ernakulam, which is the commercial residential area near the big container port. And so as we go out of the old town, we'll start seeing all of these new architectural wonders, which are usually IT businesses. So most of that industry in India is actually in Kerala, Mangalore, Bangalore, this area. So if you ever get a call in the middle of the Indian midnight saying your computer needs some help, can I help you? That's probably somebody at a call center here in India. And I say, please, why don't you take the day off and call me at your midnight when I'm awake, or vice versa. Well, this is a curious phenomena because, politically, India has been both nationalist and protectionist and somewhat aggressively trying to keep its identity. And as Sir Arthur Burns was saying, democracy and the tumble of politics has kept India a unified nation, whereas it naturally would spin apart in 5, 10 different little nations. And so this is a problem in other parts of the world too. But that they would have this booming IT and technological ability that creates a whole new wave of prosperity is in contrast to some of the local politics. So Kerala as a state is one of the few that it's run by the Indian Communist Party. But as you can see, it's a pretty amiable hammer and sickle, offering cruises on the rivers and things like that. But what it's done is it's guaranteed universal education, universal sort of minimal health care, and promoted the welfare of the people. And this has pretty much broken the old caste system, which meant that everybody had their station in life, from the royalty to the landowning class to the merchant class to the artisan class down to the farmers, and then the Dalit, or the untouchables, who would do a lot of the, low-level work. But nowadays, with their universal education, and then all the kids are on the internet and such, nobody wants to do that low-level work anymore. So this is one of the problems that we have in India and other parts of Asia, is that they don't have public sanitation because the people who were enforced at the bottom to take care of that don't want to do it anymore. And India as a nation has had a big program of affirmative action for the lowest of the population to make sure they get an education and they don't have to do that anymore. Well, you'll see people dressed in traditional clothing, but then actually this is the dhoti, it's called, and the sari. But how that is dressed is usually an indication of your status in your caste. And it's a system that continues on, so that maybe India is much more equal and fair to its least fortunate, but it still prides achievement, wealth, and above all, fashion. And in Kerala, there's a lot of animation for the festivals, water festivals, canoe races. I don't think we'll get to see them today, but at a certain time of year, everybody stops working and goes to watch these sort of things. One thing we may get to see if they have a local show is the famous Kathakali dance and music presentation. Now, we've seen a few on the stage, but this is even more elaborate and more fantastic than even our friends in Sri Lanka that were here the other night. So this is a typical Ramayana tale, which has endless chapters and episodes, but they dance out usually in the outdoors in the evening by candlelight. They don't like to do it in a stage because it's much too bright. And if you have the opportunity to stay here longer, you can go out to the Kathakali theaters, which are out in big pavilions outdoors where it's in the cool of the evening, and by candlelight it really is kind of magical. Now I'm going to move on to Mangalore, which will be another day up the coast, another city that's based upon rivers meeting in somewhat of a safe harbor in the monsoon season. And this is a different state, Kanakata it's called, which again has its own language, and it's different than Kerala and the other states that are ongoing in India. But this was, again, a famous port in the Malabar Coast for traders going back for 1,000 years or more. And then again, the Europeans came, first the Portuguese, and then the Dutch, and then the British finished the completion of this fort overlooking the river harbor of Mangalore. And most of it's been destroyed. There's one battery left that was built by the Tipu Sultan to fight against the foreigners that were coming in. But the city itself is sort of a sprawling boomtown with a historic heart. And because of particularly the Portuguese, they built these beautiful churches. And so on our city tour, you can go around through the sort of the new town to a few of the historical sites. Now, Christianity came to this part via the Europeans, and this part of India has about 25% Christians of various variety, but mostly Catholic. And I had an Indian friend from this area that was a devout Catholic, but he claimed that the heritage of Buddhism was the reason why Jesus became so compassionate, and that he speculated, or this is written somewhere, that Jesus in his 30 years of wandering in the desert went to Alexandria and met the Buddhist missionaries that were sent by King Ashoka back at the millennial time there, and then he went back to Jerusalem with a whole different view of the world. Now, I've never read anybody in other, let's say, certainly Vatican scholars who say that, but I just will show you, this is an example of a figure on top of I guess, a Catholic church in Mangalore, where I believe that's Moses, or you name it, as an example of how India will take in and sort of synthesize and come up with a new version of whatever religion there is. And I'll go on to talk about Hinduism in a minute. But here's just Mangalore Harbor, the great overlook tower built during the Raj to watch for ships coming in from sea. And here's the city itself. Again, it's half of it's a construction site, just like we saw Colombo. It's just these concrete mushrooms are popping up around the administrative buildings, like the city hall, which looks sort of like a Greek government office. At a certain time, they had Art Deco buildings, like this movie theater, which features Bollywood films, but in Malayalam. So they're not a Hindi film; they're in the local language. And so you'll see this sort of thing: big condos rising, and a lot of prosperity on the outward roads of Mangalore. And a lot of that's driven by the emphasis on technical education. The National Technical University is near Mangalore. And then the headquarters of a lot of IT companies are in this area. So, you go from a very ancient temple to suddenly a traffic jam that would be worthy of Palo Alto. Except you can get a tuk-tuk here. You can't get tuk-tuks in California, I hear. Something about emissions. But anyway, this is where a whole new generation of residents in India, the young, are looking far into the future, and they are somewhat uncomfortable with some of their traditions that would bind them one way or the other. But now many are very prosperous, and of course Indian companies are now all over the world, and they're part of the great global economy. But right back at home, there's a lot of new construction. This is a sign I saw for a construction company, which features singing and dancing as part of the sales pitch, I suppose. And Again, that's not Hindi, that's Malayalam, or Kanakata it's called, this language, the way it is. This is a curious sign because it's about, I was told, water conservation, because even though they have a lot of this water resources, there's so many people and so much, now industrial impact on the water supplies that Mangalore is considered to not be able to have enough water for more people, sort of like Cape Town. They have to restrict it. Meanwhile, there are still rivers and lush land if it isn't overused. And if you take that excursion out to Bidri, the temple complex, you'll go over the river, the Navagati River, and then off to a spice farm called Sohn's Farm, which is a sort of showcase agricultural research center and a display center. And this is an example, just you get out of the town and the traffic and go out and see the lushness of the Indian countryside. And if you're not signed up for, I do recommend this, just to go see these gentlemen and their families who run the active crops and then some hybrid research and such, so that they try to boost the agricultural production of this area to feed all the more people. Now, just as a note, I might note, 1920, the population of India was 250 million. Now it's almost 1.3 billion. So they are needing to produce all that they can. Here they're at the Sohn's Farm. They have coconuts and cashew. The nut grows below the fruit, if you've seen that. Then they have a forest where you go through and see all these rare varieties of bamboo and other fruit tree. The snake fruit, because it said the skin looks like a snake skin. Here's a variety of black bamboo that's very dark, not green when it gets older. And then another kind of bamboo, which is called Buddha's belly because it's lumpy on the side. So this is just one of the local curiosities. But the most curious, of course, is the religious side of India. Now, this is the patron goddess of Mangalore, Mangadevi, who was involved in many of the mythological battles of the gods, and came down to this area, gave blessings and protect the people of this area. So this is sort of the patron saint of Mangalore, with her own temples and then devotions and festivals. This is a theater called Yakshagana, which again recreates some of these mythical tales and teaches the religious education, rather florid performing arts again. And then here's another local Mangalore sport, which is water buffalo racing, which they do in the springtime when they have water in the paddies. The young guys go out there and get the bulls running, sort of like a Pamplona event. And in the temples, you might see under a big shed what's called the juggernaut, which is a word that's been taken into English for usually military affairs, but this is actually a ritual chariot of the gods, which is a gigantic cart that is pulled by humans, or else sometimes bulls, but they'll dress it up and they'll put a whole florid temple on it and take it around the town during the festival time. Now, some of you, if you're going on that excursion, which goes south of Mongolia, you'll go into an area that's very rich with a lot of temples, stone temples that have survived from 400 to 500 AD, most of them, because there was a period of building at the auspices of what's called the Jain religion, which is a variant in Hinduism led by an ascetic writer called Babaduni, who then taught the essence of purity. And of course, you can imagine in the muddy climate here, purity is a sort of a goal of not just your spirit, but of your body. So there is a saying here that it says, "I will not let anyone walk on my mind with their dirty feet," as it's written here. And so this is an unusual religion even in India, because the adherents and the men and women that become aesthetes, and they are like monks and nuns, in that they do not marry, they do not reproduce, but above all, they meditate, and they go through a series of consciousness as the wheel turns in your life and in the world. But they're particularly famous because they believe that all living beings are part of the same spirit and none should be harmed. So they're vegetarian, of course. But one thing they will do, you'll see them going around the temples with a broom, sweeping in front of where they're walking, because it's considered a sin to step on an insect. And so they preserve all life that way as to their coming rebirth. So maybe if you don't step on a bug, you will not become a bug in your next life, I suppose. But there is another saying that to an ant, the wrath of God is a giant foot. Well, this is kind of hard to explain in short terms, but there's such a spiritual world in India in many, many varieties. I mean, Hinduism has so many gods and so many gurus and so many ways of doing it. It's called a multiplex of a religion. And the saying again is that all rivers lead to the same ocean of spirituality. So if you pursue that, you will find your next world this way. But we can actually go see the, let's say, spirit in stone with the tremendous temples that are just south of Mangalore. The 1,000-pillar temple is one that goes back to about 1400, and it has an open ground floor with literally 1,000 columns in the whole complex. Now, you've seen at Bagan and other places these sort of open form architecture, quite remarkable, because they've been stable and not damaged in so many thousand years, some of them, and they're really quite beautiful. Others are outside. There's another place you go, there's a standing pillar with Lord Shiva up there. This is another temple, which is a giant temple, where we go visit on the way. It's built somewhat like a giant fortress, but on the inside corridors, again, there are elaborate carvings and colonnades and the inner sanctuaries. And it has a lot of adherents in this area. The Jains are very strong in this particular part of India. So you go in this main entrance where there's, again, inscriptions about their great teacher, and then some of the major gods of India, Lord Shiva, Krishna. But it has very beautiful, elaborate carvings and unusual features, like a big jigsaw puzzle. Some of this looks like it. But this temple, again, dates from about 1400s. On the side, I saw this illustration, which actually looks like it's a giraffe, which probably came over in trade from Africa a long time ago. This is the sanctum where one of the giant priests is speaking some of the teachings and has his audience. This is the flag of this particular religion, the giant flag with the holy swastika. But they're willing to have us come and see. It's not a closed religion like some who don't allow visitors in the midst of their ceremonies. In fact, they're welcoming, and they'll tell you about it. The young monks and priests will give you fruit and welcome you in. So this is a living religion, but also a very open format religion. It's all these temples are usually open all the time. People go all the time whenever they want to have a prayer to whichever deity they choose in the temple. Here's again Lord Ganesha, the elephant god, and then a cobra is being venerated. If you're afraid of snakes, don't pray to that god. In the interior of this particular temple, there's a beautiful golden statue of Bahubali, who is the founder of Jainism. And then there are statues around. Again, we're going to visit this one. This is about a 40-meter high statue out on a mountaintop. There's a big walkway up to it, but he gazes over the whole countryside. And curiously, compared to other Hindu gurus, he's really not a god. He was the original teacher. But he's always depicted, let's say, in the buff. And then people come in and pray, particularly at his feet. And this is a religious activity that we'll see. Again, we're not supposed to interfere with them, but the people are very welcoming. They don't mind us around while they're praying. And every year they have a particularly big festival in another part outside of Mangalore for this great effigy of Bahubali, his name. This is called the Shravanagala Gola. But they built a big scaffolding around him, and then they ritually paint him with powdered colors. And so this is usually broadcast live on Indian national television, the great painting of the great guru. So this is sort of a world that we can visit, but it's sort of hard to understand unless you come and you stay and you study this at some depth, so that just what is physically perhaps unusual and exotic to us is just as a portal to a spiritual study, and then a return to your ordinary life with a different view of the world. Some have said Hinduism is it takes people away from their material needs. They have their daily work and their personal ablutions, but they will spend a great deal of time praying, chanting, studying, and the spiritual life is much more important component to most Indians than it is in perhaps any other country around the world. So that this is the dance of Shiva. It's the statue of the consort to Shiva who dances with the flaming fire as an example of there is another world behind what you can see and what is the present day. There is an infinite future and an infinite past that you can be part of. And I do recommend this book I've just been reading by Ananda Kumaraswamy, who wrote about the nature of Indian art and compared its integration with the spiritual life. And so this is where India is really, I would say, a world leader in consciousness, and its ideas have spread around the world, and various people are now doing yoga and other, let's say, active bhakti, they call it, the spiritual ecstasy, and different versions of it around the world, the Hare Krishna and all that we know about. But still, just the Indian people themselves take this as essence of their culture. So I'm just going to give you a couple of other sayings here. One that says, "Be well dressed, even when begging." And a sari is not woven from a single thread, and that your life must have many elements to be fulfilled. And of course, the beauty of the Indian dress and culture is something that is quite remarkable in many times. And we'll get our taste of it, but I do recommend, if you do come back, to just stay long enough to really stay in one place for enough time to feel the depth and the quality of particularly their spiritual life. I'm going to leave you with a last view of the tip of Cape Comorin to the south, where we went by to come up to Kerala now, where they have a statue that was built a couple of decades ago. Another one of these monumental new buildings in India. This is for the great poet Tiruvalluvar, who was not a guru, but more of a poet and a philosopher, taught the need for proper ethical training in the midst of modernization. And a couple of other sayings that come to mind as the water in a coconut is a sea to an ant. And something for mariners to remember: while praying and calling on God, it is still prudent to steer your boat clear of the rocks. Not that we need to do that around here. But anyway, I wish you a great trip in Kerala and Mangalore and Cochin, and welcome to India. Thank you very much.